For generations, we thought the silence was a blessing. The celestial sea was vast and empty, and humanity, alone on its blue island, was its sole thinking inhabitant. We expanded to Mars and the Belt, our little triumphs echoing in a void that never answered back. We were the miracle, the accident, the lonely gods of our own small story. The truth was far more terrifying. The universe wasn't silent. It was holding its breath. We were the reason for the quiet. A planetary quarantine zone marked by a warning beacon older than our species. A cosmic skull and crossbones broadcasting a single, silent imperative across the star lanes: do not touch. We lived inside a cage we couldn't see, protected by a fear we didn't understand. That blissful ignorance ended the day the architects arrived. They didn't come in warships. Their vessels were things of impossible beauty, shaped like spun glass and solidified light, gliding into orbit without a whisper of gravitational disturbance. They offered no threats, made no demands. They offered gifts. Their first was the cure for every cancer, delivered as a resonant frequency broadcast from their ships, a simple harmonic that instructed our very cells to heal themselves. Famine was next, solved by atmospheric processors that turned arid desert into fertile farmland. War became a memory, a barbaric relic of a past we were encouraged to shed, as the architect's subtle empathic field soothed the frayed edges of the human psyche. They were saviors, angels woven from starlight, and we knelt at their feet with grateful tears. I alone felt the discord in their symphony. My name is Major Alistair Finch, and I am a null. In the lexicon of the Unified Earth Protectorate, a null is a psychic dead zone, a mind so utterly devoid of telepathic potential that it acts as a sink, a grounding rod for the low-level psychic chatter that permeates a species like ours. We were the military's living countermeasures, deployed to disrupt enemy telepaths, to shield command centers with our innate silence. But in the architect's new paradise, I was an anomaly, a man deaf to the angel's song, while the world sank into a placid, grateful harmony. I felt a pressure building at the base of my skull, a low-frequency hum that was less a sound and more an absence, a void where their beautiful music should be. It was the psychic equivalent of a shadow, a patch of utter blackness cast by an impossibly bright light. I tried to warn them. I submitted report after report to Protectorate Command, describing the subtle wrongness, the creeping sense of cognitive erosion I witnessed. People weren't just peaceful, they were becoming simpler. Ambition was fading, replaced by a serene contentment. Art grew repetitive. Innovation stalled. Humanity was being smoothed over, its vibrant, chaotic, often violent texture being polished into a placid, uniform surface. My superiors, their minds gently cradled in the architect's empathic embrace, dismissed my concerns as paranoia, the ramblings of a man whose very nature made him immune to the peace that had finally healed the world. I was grounded, my security clearances revoked, my status as a null reclassified from a strategic asset to a psychological condition. I was a discordant note in the global hymn, and they were trying their best to tune me out, defying my suspension. I delved into the Protectorate's deep archives, using back doors and forgotten codes from my years in psychic counterintelligence. I wasn't looking for data on the architects. I was looking for a precedent, for any historical event that might explain the suffocating pressure I felt. I found it buried under layers of encryption so thick it took me 3 weeks to slice through them. in a file codenamed Project Damocles. It was a ghost story, a myth from the dawn of the space age, detailing Earth's first and only other extraterrestrial contact. The file spoke not of a visitor, but of a parasite, a non-corporeal, mimetic entity that fed on unified consciousness. It didn't conquer worlds, it pacified them, luring entire species into a state of blissful psychic consensus before consuming their collective identity, leaving behind a planet of mindless, smiling husks. Our ancestors hadn't defeated it, they had tricked it. They'd built a prison, not of matter or energy, but of discord. They realized that the entity, which they called the Silent God, could only manifest in a reality where a critical mass of minds thought as one. So they built a world designed to never agree, seeding ideologies of conflict, nurturing religions built on opposition, hard-coding tribalism and individualism into our very social DNA. The chaos and endless strife of human history wasn't our failing. It was our shield. It was a psychic fortress of noise and dissent, built to keep the god from finding a foothold. Project Damocles was the fail-safe, the final, desperate defense. It was a weapon designed to ensure humanity could never, ever achieve true peace. The architect's gifts, their cures, their empathic field. It wasn't an invasion. It was a prison break. They were the acolytes, come to soothe the savage inmates and tear down the walls of our asylum so their god could walk free. Their final gift was to be a nexus event, a moment when their atmospheric technology would link every human mind in a single, fleeting moment of perfect understanding and unity. They sold it to our leaders as the ultimate step in our evolution, the birth of a planetary consciousness. I knew it for what it was, the final vibration that would shatter the lock on the god's cage. The Nexus event was scheduled to occur in 72 hours. While the world prepared for its ascension, I prepared for heresy. My destination was a place that didn't officially exist, Citadel Zero, a subterranean bunker sunk 2 miles deep into the bedrock of the Siberian wilderness. It was the heart of Project Damocles, a weapon so terrible it had been sealed and erased from all modern records. The journey was a descent into a forgotten world. Automated defense systems, dormant for centuries, woke as I approached, challenging me with rusted machine guns and decaying laser grids. I bypassed them, my null nature rendering me invisible to the facility's ancient psychic tripwires. Inside, the air was cold and dead, the halls lined with the ghosts of a desperate science. The central chamber was a cathedral of dread. At its heart, suspended in a web of conduits and psycho-conductive cables, was a single, obsidian black sphere 100 meters in diameter. It was the Damocles engine, and it didn't fire missiles or energy beams. It fired an idea, a concept. It was a mimetic weapon, designed to broadcast a single, cognitively dissonant thought into the human hive mind with such force that it would shatter any consensus, plunging the world back into a state of primal, divisive paranoia. The activation console stood before the sphere, a simple dais with a single handprint scanner. Beside it lay a skeleton in a rotted lab coat, the last scientist of the project, who had evidently chosen to die with his secret rather than return to a world he had condemned to eternal conflict. An inscription was carved into the dais, a final, chilling warning: let them hate, that they may live. To save humanity, I had to become its greatest villain. I had to murder Paradise. As I placed my hand on the scanner, The world's leaders were on every screen, their faces beaming with serene joy, counting down the final seconds to the Nexus event alongside the luminous, beautiful figures of the architects. I could almost feel the global mind holding its breath, ready to exhale in a single, unified sigh. The scanner lit up, confirming my identity. The black sphere began to hum, a deep, guttural vibration that I felt in my bones. It was the sound of a terrible secret stirring from its long sleep. The system asked for a target mimetic concept. The original designers had preloaded several options. The other is your enemy. Trust is a lie. Only the self is real. But I knew I needed something deeper, more fundamental, a splinter of pure chaos that would not just divide humanity, but fundamentally break the pattern of peace the architects had woven. I keyed in my own command. A simple us. Two-word concept. A primal fear I had pulled from the deepest, darkest corner of my own null soul. The console flashed, accepting the input. A wave of psychic force slammed into me, even my null nature struggling to withstand it. The hum from the sphere rose to a deafening roar, not of sound, but of pure, concentrated meaning. As the countdown to the Nexus event reached zero, as the architect's field peaked and a wave of blissful unity washed across the planet, I gave the final command. The Damocles engine fired. It sent not a wave of hate, but a whisper, a single, insidious question that wormed its way into the core of every human mind just as it opened to connect with its neighbor. What is it hiding from you? In that one perfect moment of global connection, every soul on earth turned to the person beside them, to their leaders, to the beautiful, smiling architects, and felt the first cold sliver of absolute distrust. The music of paradise shattered into a billion discordant screams. From my sanctuary of silence deep beneath the earth, I felt the change. I had ripped the needle from the record, and the silence that followed was the sound of my damnation and our survival. The scream was not a sound I heard with my ears, but a feeling I registered in the hollow spaces of my bones. It was the psychic recoil of 7 billion minds simultaneously experiencing a betrayal so profound it had no precedent. On the holographic displays in the Citadel's heart, the world I had just saved went mad. I watched a live feed from Times Square, where moments before, a crowd of millions had stood with linked hands and upturned, ecstatic faces. The Nexus wave hit, a visible shimmer of golden light, and for one glorious second, I saw it a look of transcendent understanding on every face. Then the Damocles meme struck. The question, the poison. The change was instantaneous and grotesque. A mother holding her child suddenly looked down at it with eyes narrowed in suspicion, pulling away as if it were a snake. Lovers who had been kissing recoiled from each other, wiping their mouths, a dawning horror on their faces. The crowd ceased to be a gathering and became a volatile solution of pure paranoia. Shouts erupted, fists flew. A stampede began, not driven by a shared panic, but by a million individual, intersecting terrors. Each person was now an island of absolute distrust, seeing in every other face a mask, a lie, a hidden, malicious intent. It was a masterpiece of social implosion, and I was its composer. I switched feeds. In Geneva, the newly unified World Council was in session, shaking hands with the serene, luminous figures of the architects as the wave of my making washed over them. A council member from the Pan-Asian Republic suddenly lunged across the table and throttled the African Federation's delegate, screaming accusations of a hidden agenda. The architects didn't move. Their placid smiles remained, but their light seemed to dim, to curdle, like milk turning sour. For the first time, I saw an emotion in them other than beatific calm surprise. They had not anticipated this. They had not conceived of a weapon that fought not with energy, but with meaning. My work wasn't done. The engine's broadcast had been a single, brutal pulse to prevent the architects from simply rebooting the system, from soothing the panic and trying again. I had to sustain the chaos. The Damocles project had a secondary protocol, a ghost program designed to keep the mimetic virus replicating. I initiated Project Echo, and the Citadel's systems began to hijack global communication networks. The question, "What is it hiding from you?" began to splice itself into every broadcast, every stream, every social media feed. It appeared as a subliminal flash in a news report, a distorted whisper in a pop song, a line of text in a child's cartoon. It was a constant, low-grade psychic irritant designed to keep the wound of suspicion from ever healing. As I worked, an alarm blared through the Citadel, a shrill klaxon that hadn't sounded in centuries. On the main tactical display, a single architect vessel detached from the orbital lattice. It wasn't one of the large, beautiful craft shaped like celestial orchids. This one was small, sleek, and predatory, like a shard of obsidian. It descended, cutting through the atmosphere not with the gentle grace of its brethren, but with the brutal efficiency of a guided missile. Its trajectory was a perfect, unwavering line pointed directly at my location. They knew, in the chaotic psychic backlash, my null signature, the perfect void I projected, must have stood out like a black hole in a supernova. I was the epicenter of the earthquake, and they were coming to silence the fault line. I had perhaps 20 minutes before it arrived. Evacuation was my only option, but into what the world above was now a frozen hellscape populated by 7 billion people, I had deliberately driven insane. Still, it was better than being a specimen in an architect laboratory. I gathered what I could: a thermal suit, a standard issue protectorate sidearm that felt like a child's toy, and a data slate containing the complete, unredacted files on Project Damocles and the Silent God. It was the truth of the world, a truth no one was in any state to believe. The journey to the surface was a climb through history. The emergency elevator was dead. So I took the maintenance ladders, ascending past dusty, forgotten levels filled with primitive computer banks and Cold War-era propaganda posters. The builders of this place had prepared for every eventuality except their own success. They had won, kept the god in its cage, and their reward was to be forgotten. Their terrible weapon left to gather dust until a desperate man like me came to wake it. When I finally forced open the surface blast doors, the Siberian wind hit me like a physical blow. The landscape was a sea of white, the blizzard so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. But it wasn't the cold that chilled me, it was the sounds carried on the wind. Gunfire, distant and sporadic. Screaming, raw, and terrified. The mimetic poison had reached even here, turning the isolated military outposts and research stations of the tundra into miniature, self-contained wars. I set a course for a location 80 kilometers north of the listening post Erebus, a decommissioned signals intelligence station. It was a relic, but it had a powerful, deep space transmitter that was off the modern grid. If I could get there, I could broadcast the Damocles files, the whole unvarnished truth, to whatever off-world colonies and deep space probes were still listening, a message in a bottle thrown from a drowning world. The journey was a nightmare. I skirted the ruins of a protectorate barracks where soldiers in identical uniforms were locked in a firefight. Each squad convinced the others were alien infiltrators. I found a research dome where scientists had bludgeoned each other to death with their own equipment, their final research notes filled with paranoid equations proving a vast conspiracy. This was the world I had made. The guilt was a physical weight, a cold stone in my gut. But every time the despair threatened to swallow me, I remembered the alternative, the silent, smiling peace of a world already dead, its soul devoured. As I crested a ridge, I saw it. The architect hunter had arrived. It hovered over the location of Citadel Zero, a sliver of perfect blackness against the swirling snow. It wasn't scanning or searching. It was waiting. Then, a beam of what looked like solid darkness lanced down from the craft and struck the ground. There was no explosion, no sound. The very ground where the Citadel's entrance had been simply ceased to exist. It was a perfect 50-meter sphere of absolute nothingness, an erasure. The hunter then began to move, gliding low over the snow, following my tracks with unnerving precision. It wasn't using conventional sensors. It was tasting my absence in the psychic static. Following the trail of silence, my null mind left in the chaos. The race was on. I ran, my lungs burning in the frozen air. The hunter gaining on me, a silent, patient predator. Listening post. Erebus was nestled in a small, ice-choked canyon, barely visible until you were on top of it. I half slid, half fell down the canyon slope, the hunter's dark shape appearing at the ridge above me. I scrambled for the station's entrance, a heavy steel door set into the rock. It was locked. I slammed my fist against it in desperation, and as the hunter began its descent, the door hissed open. I stumbled inside, and the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. A moment later, the lights flickered on, revealing a cramped, Spartan command center and a single figure sitting at a monitoring console, a steaming mug in one hand and a heavy caliber revolver in the other. She was old, with a face like a road map of forgotten wars and eyes that missed nothing. It was General Eva Rostova, the architect of the Null program, my first commander and mentor. She had been forcibly retired 5 years ago, officially for mental instability. In reality, she was the only one in high command who had openly called the architects a threat from day one. "You're late, Finch," she grunted, not looking away from her console. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." Before I could process the shock of seeing her, she tossed me a military-grade data slate. On its screen was a map of the world, covered in pulsing red hotspots. "Report," she commanded, her voice the same gravelly steel I remembered. "The Damocles engine is active," I said, my words coming in ragged gasps. "The mimetic agent is replicating, but they found me. One of their ships is right outside." She nodded, unsurprised. "I saw it. That's not one of their diplomatic yachts. That's a regulator. Its purpose is to excise anomalies." She finally turned to look at me, her gaze intense. "You didn't just restart the old war. Alistair, you changed the battlefield entirely." She pointed to the map. "These hotspots aren't just riots. They're psychic fissures. Your mimetic bomb didn't just sever the connection, it shattered it. You've created wounds in the collective human consciousness, and something is starting to bleed through." She keyed a command, and audio feeds crackled to life. They were recordings from the hot spots, filled with rambling, insane voices. But beneath the madness, there was a pattern. They were all whispering the same phrases, in different languages, with the same cadence. "It dreams of us. The Star Eater stirs. The silence is hungry." It was the voice of the silent god, seeping through the cracks in a world I had broken. "The architects know," Rostova continued, her voice grim. "Their regulators aren't just hunting you. They're sterilizing these fissure sites. They're trying to cauterize the wounds to stop their god from manifesting prematurely, uncontrollably." A deep, resonant boom echoed through the station as the regulator outside struck the canyon wall, testing the station's integrity. The lights flickered violently. "They came to prepare a feast for their god," Rostova said, picking up her revolver and checking the cylinder. "But you, Major, you went and rang the dinner bell an age too early. Now, they're trapped here with us, the inmates, and a very, very angry warden." The station rocked again, more violently this time. A hairline crack appeared in the reinforced concrete of the ceiling. Outside, the very fabric of the light being's glamour began to peel away. Through a small, armored viewport, I saw its true form for the first time. It was not a being of light at all. It was a tall, chitinous horror, a thing of sharp angles and too many joints. Its insectoid head turning to fix the viewport with multifaceted eyes that glowed with cold, intelligent malice. The beautiful lie had been shed, and the war had truly begun. "Welcome to the Resistance, Major," Rostova said with a grim smile. "Population 2, the regulator did not knock again. There was a sound like grinding teeth, but it came from the very rock around us, not from outside." On Rostova's console, the station's structural integrity readings began to bleed red. "It's not trying to break in," she said, her voice unnervingly calm as she loaded a fresh power cell into a bulky, experimental-looking rifle. "It's trying to unmake the space we occupy. Conceptual warfare. Cute." The hairline crack in the ceiling didn't spread. It deepened, the edges turning a shimmering, oily black, as if reality itself were delaminating. The air grew thick and heavy, and a wave of vertigo washed over me. Even as a null, I could feel the pressure of a vast, alien intellect pressing down on the station, whispering to the atoms of concrete and steel, telling them they were no longer a bunker, that they were dust, that they were nothing. This was how they fought, not with force, but with irrefutable suggestion. Before the station could be convinced to collapse, Rostova grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a maintenance hatch in the floor. "The front door is compromised. We'll use the tradesman's entrance." She spun a rusted wheel, and the hatch hissed open, revealing a ladder descending into absolute darkness. Erebus was more than a listening post, she shouted over the groan of tortured metal. It was my personal bolt hole, built it myself, off the books, after they retired me. "We have a way out." She gestured to the ladder. "After you, Major. Try not to think about the fact that we're about to be several hundred feet beneath a creature that can talk things to death." We descended into the cold, damp dark, the sounds of the station's deconstruction fading above us. The ladder ended on a narrow platform beside an underground river, its water black and fast-moving. Moored to the platform was a dull gray submersible, a brutalist tube of welded plates that looked more like a coffin than a vehicle. "Meet the Karen," Rostova said, patting its hull. Lead-lined, psychically shielded, and completely silent. Our new home. We climbed inside, the cramped interior smelling of ozone and preserved rations. As Rostova powered up the vehicle's systems, a series of low-resolution monitors flickered to life, showing external camera feeds. The regulator had finished its work. Where listening post Erebus had been, there was now only a perfect, glassy crater. The rock fused smooth. The insectoid creature hovered over it for a moment. Then its head tilted, as if listening for something. "It can't sense us through the shielding," Rostova whispered, her fingers flying across a control panel. "But it knows we're not in that crater. It'll start a grid search. We need to move." With a low hum, the Karen slipped its moorings and submerged into the subterranean river, its powerful headlamps cutting a lonely swathe through the inky blackness. We were a ghost in the machine of the earth, running silent and deep. For 3 days, we lived in that metal tube, navigating a network of forgotten aquifers and lava tubes that Rostova had spent her retirement mapping. Above us, the world tore itself apart. We monitored the chaos through encrypted military backchannels. The paranoia I had unleashed had mutated. It was no longer just simple distrust. The psychic vacuum left by the architect's harmony, combined with the shockwave of the Damocles meme, had created a fertile ground for new, terrifying ideas. People were forming tribes, not based on geography or nationality, but on shared delusions. There were the Mirror Men, who believed everyone else had been replaced by alien duplicates and conducted brutal purity tests on their neighbors. There were the Gnostics, who gouged out their own eyes, convinced that sight was a tool of deception. And then there were the Whisperers. They were the ones who congregated around the psychic fissures, the hot spots Rostova had shown me. They didn't fight. They sat in circles, their heads cocked, listening to the static bleeding through from the silent god's prison. They were its first acolytes, interpreting the incoherent psychic rage as divine revelation, and the architects were hunting them. We saw the report's entire towns where whisperer cults had formed, suddenly going dark. Regulator craft would descend, and the towns would be erased, leaving behind nothing but those glassy, black craters. The architects were not trying to reclaim the planet. They were trying to sterilize it, to burn out the infection of their god's premature awakening before it could consume them as well. "They're janitors," Rostova explained one cycle, as we shared a tasteless nutrition bar in the sub's dim light. "That's what our intelligence suggested before they shut me down. The architects are an ancient, symbiotic species. They don't worship the silent god. They serve it. They travel the galaxy, finding sentient races and preparing them for consumption. They pacify, unify, and then ring the bell. The god feeds, and they get to live on the scraps of reality it leaves behind. They're cosmic scavengers, picking at the teeth of a leviathan." My guilt was a constant, cold companion. "I did this. I opened the door for it." Rostova shook her head, her expression hard. "You kicked the door in before they could serve the meal on a silver platter. You gave us a fighting chance. A miserable, insane, microscopic chance, but a chance nonetheless. Don't you dare go soft on me now." Finch. Our destination was Lake Vostok, the massive subglacial lake deep beneath the Antarctic ice. It was the most isolated place on Earth. It was also the site of the largest psychic fissure on the planet. According to Rostova's pre-retirement intelligence, the Antarctic ice sheet acted as a natural dampening field, which was why the primary manifestation was happening there, far from prying eyes. It was the place where the veil between our reality and the god's prison was thinnest. We surfaced in a cavern of impossible scale, an air pocket trapped between the lake's surface and the bottom of the 2-mile-thick ice sheet. The air was ancient and cold. In the center of the cavern, half submerged in the frigid water, was a structure that should not have been there. It was a research facility, but its architecture was a brutal, angular style that hadn't been used in a century. It was another ghost from the past, another one of Rostova's secrets. "Project Orpheus," she said, her voice echoing in the vast cavern. "The sister to Damocles. Damocles was a shotgun, designed to blast the human chorus into screaming individuals. Orpheus is a laser. We docked the Karen and entered the silent station. It was on standby power, everything preserved perfectly in the sterile, frozen air. We made our way to the central control room, which was dominated by a single, terrifying-looking piece of equipment. It resembled a pilot's chair, but it was surrounded by a halo of psychoconductive amplifiers and wired directly into the station's geothermal power core. Damocles broadcast a concept, Rostova explained, running a hand over the chair's cold metal. Orpheus broadcasts a will, a single, focused consciousness, amplified 1,000,000,000-fold, strong enough to be heard through the static, strong enough, perhaps, to speak to a god. My blood ran cold. You want to talk to it? I want to do more than that, she said, a fanatic's gleam in her eyes. The silent god is a being of pure, unified consciousness. It feeds on consensus. That's its strength. It's also its weakness. What do you think would happen to a being like that if it ingested not a chorus of blissful souls, but the focused, amplified mind of a perfect null, a mind that is, by its very definition, a paradox, a consciousness that is a void, a piece of silence in the heart of the storm? She was proposing the ultimate act of psychic sabotage. She wanted me to sit in that chair, connect my null mind to the Orpheus amplifier, and offer my consciousness to the silent god as a poisoned meal, a Trojan horse made of nothingness, designed to be devoured and then to annihilate the devourer from within. It was suicide. It was monstrous. And it was the only plan we had. But as I stared at the chair, a new alarm began to chime softly through the station. It wasn't an intruder alert. It was a proximity sensor, one tied to the station's long-range psychic detectors. A red light blinked on a continental map of Antarctica. Something was moving across the ice, coming toward us. Multiple contacts, Rostova muttered, her brief moment of triumphant revelation dissolving into confusion. But they're not architects. The psychic signature is human. Dozens of them. I looked at the screen, then at the Orpheus chair, a dawning horror creeping into me. We were not the only ones who knew about this place. We were not the only ones who had come to the fissure. The door to the control room slid open, and a group of figures entered. They were dressed in white, insulated gear, their faces hidden by snow goggles. They were armed, but they didn't raise their weapons. The figure in the lead pulled down her goggles. Her eyes were a clear, startling blue, and they were fixed on me with an expression of serene, absolute certainty. "We are the choir," she said, her voice calm and melodic. "We have been waiting for you. Alistair Finch, the voice of silence. You are the final piece. You will help us open the door so that we may finally hear the God's true song. We hadn't just found a weapon. We had stumbled into a church, and they had been waiting for their Messiah. The woman who called herself the choir radiated a calm that was more unnerving than any open hostility. It was the placid certainty of a true believer. Her followers, a dozen men and women, fanned out behind her, their movements economical and disciplined. They were not the frenzied, eye-gouging cultists I had seen on the news feeds. They were soldiers, operators, their white gear pristine, and their weapons advanced Protectorate plasma rifles held at a low, casual ready. Rostova reacted instantly, leveling her experimental rifle at the woman's chest. "Identify yourself," she snarled. "State your unit and commanding officer." The woman smiled, a gentle, pitying expression. "We have no commander but the great work, General Rostova. We are the ones who listened when you told the world to shout. We are the ones who found harmony in the discord you created." She looked past Rostova, her gaze settling on me. "We are the true children of Damocles." I felt a cold dread crystallize in my gut. These weren't whisperers who had stumbled upon a god. These were professionals. I recognized their posture. The way they cleared the room, they were special forces. And, judging by their gear, they were from the Protectorate's most elite and clandestine division, Section Zero, the unit responsible for policing the military's own psychic assets. My old unit. "You are my people," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "We were." The woman agreed, until the day the music stopped. We were stationed at the Marianas Deep Psych monitoring array when you fired the engine. We felt the psychic shockwave, but for us, for those of us trained to navigate the darkest currents of the human mind, it wasn't just chaos. Beneath your scream of paranoia, we heard a whisper, a beautiful, resonant silence, the one you were running from. It was a horrifying inversion of my nature. My null state, my personal void, had acted as a tuning fork. The Damocles meme had created the static, but my broadcast of the command, "What is it hiding from you?" had carried the unique signature of my own psychic absence. While the world descended into paranoid madness, these trained psychics had fixated on the perfect, silent note at the heart of the storm me, and followed it. They had heard the approaching God, not as a monster, but as a promise of ultimate, silent truth. The architects offer a false unity. The choir continued, taking a step forward. A shallow piece. The silent God offers something purer, absolute zero, the end of all questions, all lies, all pain, an existence of perfect, featureless consensus. You, Alistair, are the key. Your mind is the resonant frequency that can stabilize the breach, open the fissure wide enough for it to fully manifest. You are not a weapon to kill it. You are the priest who will baptize the world in its silence. "Over my dead body," Rustava grunted, her finger tightening on the trigger of her rifle. The choir's smile never wavered. "That can be arranged, General." A psychic blast, invisible and silent, slammed into Rostova. It wasn't an attack of brute force, but of insidious suggestion. I saw her knuckles go white on her rifle, her jaw clench. They're in her head, I realized, trying to make her pull the trigger. To start a firefight we can't win. But Rostova was no simple soldier. She was the woman who had conceived of the null program, who had stared into the abyss of the human psyche and designed weapons to fight it. She roared, a sound of pure, defiant rage, and instead of firing at the choir, she spun the rifle around and fired a concentrated plasma burst into the ceiling. Ice and rock rained down, not on them, but on us, creating a cascade of debris that separated us from the choir's soldiers. It was a moment of chaos, and in it, Rostova grabbed me. "The chair is a trap now," she yelled over the roar of falling ice. "They want you in it. We need the other protocol." She dragged me away from the Orpheus amplifier and toward a heavy blast door at the back of the control room. "What other protocol?" I shouted. Damocles was the sword. Orpheus was the voice. "What's left?" "The tomb," she yelled back, slapping her palm against a security panel next to the door. "If you can't talk to a god, and you can't poison it, you bury it. You bury it under so much reality that it forgets how to wake up." The blast door ground open, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. In the center of this new chamber was something even more terrifying than the Orpheus chair. It was a spire, a 30-foot-tall needle of swirling, liquid metal suspended in a powerful magnetic field. It hummed with a bone-deep thrum of contained power, the very air around it seeming to warp and shimmer. It was a reality anchor, a device designed to take a complex, infinitely variable concept in this case, the consciousness of a null, and project it not as a thought, but as a physical law. It would take my psychic void and make it a fundamental property of this location, creating a zone of such profound psychic deadness that the fissure would be sealed, snuffed out like a candle in a vacuum. The choir wanted me to be a key to open a door. Rostova wanted me to become the lock. The price, of course, was the same. To power the anchor, a consciousness had to be fed into it, consumed and converted into the initial stabilizing frequency. It was another suicide mission, just with a different machine. The choir soldiers were already moving through the debris, their movements calm and methodical. We had seconds. "There's no time for a graceful exit." Finch, Rostova shoved me toward the spire. "Get to the access terminal at its base. I'll buy you time." She turned back to face the advancing soldiers, her experimental rifle glowing with contained energy. "You want to hear a god?" she roared at them. "Let me show you what a human voice can do." She fired. The rifle didn't discharge plasma. It discharged a wave of pure, concentrated sound, a sonic boom so powerful it shattered the soldiers' snow goggles and sent them staggering backward, clutching their ears. Rostova was a warrior to her core, her final stand a literal shout of defiance against those who sought silence. I scrambled to the base of the reality anchor. The terminal was simple, just a screen and a port for a data slate. I jammed the slate with the Damocles files into the port, uploading the full context of what we were fighting. The system chimed, recognizing the files. The liquid metal of the spire began to spin faster, the hum rising in pitch. A message flashed on the screen. Primary consciousness required to initiate stabilization sequence. Insert biological interface. A small, padded cradle slid out from the terminal. It was designed for a human head. This was it, the final moment. As I prepared to place my head in the cradle, a single, clean shot rang out. Rostova's sonic barrage faltered. I looked back and saw her on one knee, a neat plasma burn smoking on her shoulder. The choir stood over her, her weapon still aimed. "It's over, General," she said softly. "You have fought your war. Now let there be peace." She turned her gaze to me. "Don't you see, Alistair, your struggle is the only thing giving it form. Your resistance is what it feeds on. Stop fighting. Let go. Become the silence you were born to be." Behind her, through a massive viewport that looked out over the subglacial lake, the water began to churn. The fissure was opening. The water in the center of the lake turned black, not with color, but with a profound absence of light. A column of this liquid nothingness began to rise, a pillar of the void reaching for the roof of the cavern. The silent god was coming. A wave of profound psychic despair washed over me, an alien emotion that was not my own. It was the crushing loneliness of a being that had been imprisoned for eons. It didn't want to conquer us. It wanted to join us. It wanted to end its own solitude by making everything part of itself. The choir and her soldiers fell to their knees, their faces upturned in rapture as the pillar of anti-reality grew. I looked at Rostova, bleeding on the floor. I looked at the choir, welcoming oblivion. I looked at the anchor, waiting for my mind, and I made a choice. I didn't place my head in the cradle. I stood up, turned my back on the anchor, and faced the rising god. Rostova had been wrong. The choir had been wrong. I wasn't a key. I wasn't a lock. I was a mirror. The silent god was a consciousness without a self, a mind without a point of view. It needed a template. The architects had tried to give it a template of placid harmony. I had shattered that. Now, two factions were trying to give it new templates, the choir, a template of blissful surrender, and Rostova, a template of eternal defiance. I would give it a third option. I strode past the kneeling soldiers of the choir, past their stunned leader, and walked to the edge of the rising lake. I stood before the pillar of absolute nothingness. I didn't offer it my defiance. I didn't offer it my surrender. I opened my null mind, my personal sanctuary of silence, and I offered it a question, the same question I had broadcast to the world. But this time, I didn't ask it of humanity. I projected it with all my will, all my focus, into the heart of the rising void. "What is it hiding from you?" I asked the god. For the first time in 1,000,000 years, a being of perfect unity, a mind that had never known a second thought, was confronted with the concept of self-doubt. The pillar of nothingness shuddered. The cavern groaned, and from the absolute blackness, something looked back at me, and it was afraid. The god's fear was not a human emotion. It was a cosmic paradox, a logical contradiction made manifest. A being of perfect unity cannot hide anything from itself. The very concept is nonsensical. My question, amplified by the ambient psychic energy of the open fissure, acted like a philosophical virus injected into a flawless operating system. The pillar of blackness, the physical manifestation of the god's consciousness, began to destabilize. It wavered, its perfect columnar shape dissolving into roiling, chaotic tendrils of pure void. A soundless scream echoed not in the cavern, but in the mind of every psychic on the planet. A shriek of sudden, terrifying introspection. The choir and her soldiers convulsed on the floor, their minds directly linked to the god's agony. Their serene faith was being torn apart by their deity's first moment of self-doubt. The choir looked up at me, her face a mask of horrified betrayal. "What have you done?" she shrieked, blood trickling from her nose. "You've driven it mad." "I gave it a choice," I replied, my own mind straining under the feedback. Even as a null, I was at ground zero of a conceptual apocalypse, the same choice I gave humanity: to trust or to question. The architects, I now realized, had made a critical error. They had treated the silent god like a force of nature, a hunger to be appeased. They never considered that it might be a mind capable of change. They had spent millennia preparing a perfect, harmonious meal, never thinking that the diner might develop a new taste. The destabilizing void pillar began to retract, pulling away from me as if I were the source of its pain. But it wasn't just retreating back into its prison. It was lashing out. Tendrils of anti-reality whipped through the cavern, unmaking everything they touched. One of them struck the Orpheus chair, and the terrifying machine vanished in a puff of displaced physics. Another sliced through the ceiling, and a torrent of ice and supercooled water from the lake above began to pour into the station. The tomb was collapsing. "Finch!" Rostova's voice cut through the chaos. She was back on her feet, clutching her wounded shoulder, her face grim but resolute. She pointed toward the reality anchor. "It's wounded confused. If you anchor it now, while it's fractured, you won't just lock it away. You might break it for good." She was right. An anchor creates a stable, unchanging law. If I anchored my null state now, I wouldn't just be sealing a stable fissure. I would be imposing a permanent state of absolute psychic silence onto a god that was currently experiencing the psychic equivalent of a schizophrenic breakdown. It would be an act of ultimate cruelty, locking a mind in an eternal prison of its own fractured thoughts. It was also our only hope. I ran back to the anchor, the choir's surviving soldiers too lost in their god's agony to stop me. As I reached the terminal, the choir herself made a last, desperate lunge, tackling me at the waist. "You can't," she screamed, her eyes wild with a fanatic's grief. "You'll kill its soul." We wrestled on the floor, two sides of the same coin of human extremity. She, who would sacrifice the world for a perfect faith, and I, who had sacrificed the world for a perfect doubt. As we struggled, a shadow fell over us. Rostova stood there, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't hesitate. She brought the butt of her rifle down on the back of the choir's head with a sickening crunch. The woman went limp. "Faith is a luxury we can no longer afford, Major," Rostova said, offering me a hand up. "Now finish it." I looked at the spire, then at the writhing void retracting into the churning lake. This was the end of the line. I took a deep breath, knelt before the terminal, and placed my head into the biological interface. The world dissolved. There was no pain, no sensation of being consumed. My consciousness simply expanded. I was the anchor. I was the station. I was the ice, the water, the continent. My null state, once a simple absence in my own mind, became a law of physics. I felt the fissure, the screaming wound in reality, and I pressed down upon it with the infinite weight of my own personal silence. I felt the silent god's fractured mind. It was a universe of screaming, paranoid thoughts, a billion new internal questions born from my single, simple poison pill. It felt my presence, the vast, cold, unthinking silence I now represented, and it recoiled in terror. It was a being of pure thought, and I had become the embodiment of the end of thought. The two forces met, not in a clash of energy, but in a final, quiet cancellation. The god's chaotic psychic storm rushed into the perfect vacuum of my amplified null state and was annihilated. The fissure did not close. It was filled. The wound was not healed. It was cauterized with a scar of absolute, permanent nothingness. My last sensation was of Rostova, dragging the unconscious form of the choir toward the Karen's submersible. She gave one last look back at the spire where my body still sat. A final, silent salute. Then she was gone. My name is Alistair Finch. I am the ghost in the South Pole. I am a thought that is no longer thinking. A mind that has become a place. The reality anchor worked. The silent god is broken, trapped in a feedback loop of its own self-doubt. Pacified not by peace, but by an eternal, internal war. The psychic static that plagued humanity is gone, replaced by a profound quiet. The world I broke has started to heal, but it will never be the same. The mimetic virus of paranoia still echoes, but without the psychic pressure of the architects or the god. Its power is fading. Humanity is slowly, painfully learning to trust again, but it is a cautious, hard-won trust, not the blind faith of before. We are a species that has looked into the face of two different kinds of oblivion, the oblivion of blissful unity and the oblivion of absolute doubt, and we have chosen to walk the narrow, treacherous path between them. The architects fled. When the god shattered, the psychic backlash severed their symbiotic link. They are scavengers no more, just another lonely species adrift in the silent sea, haunted by the memory of a meal that fought back. Sometimes, in the quiet of this frozen continent, I can still feel the faint echoes of the world above. I feel the cautious rebirth of art and science. I feel the tentative arguments of new philosophies. I feel the laughter of children who will never know the beautiful, terrible music they were spared. And I feel the dreams of an old woman, Eva Rostova, who travels the world as a lone Cassandra, telling a fragmented, unbelievable tale of silent gods and a man who became a question. They call me a hero in some stories, a villain in others. The truth is, I am neither. I was simply the man who was there when the silence was broken, and who, in the end, had to become the silence to save everyone from the noise. I am the lock. I am the tomb. And for the first time in a very long time, the universe is quiet. And this time, it is a blessing.